It is with a heavy heart that I welcome you to the Fantasy Football News Week 9 edition. As always, I'm your host, Eric. An absolutely awful week of fantasy football has left the league devastated. Three matches this week featured both teams scoring under 100 points, and one match produced the lowest combined score of the season. The league also set a record for lowest total combined score at 995.99. And now, on to the matchups. The first matchup this week was Generic Football Team versus Wu Tang Cash. Standout performance for Generic Football Team were Lamar Jackson coming back from some relatively poor performances the past few weeks to post 37.14 points. Cole Komet with 11.7 and Graham Gano with 11 points were also great for GFT. Wu Tang Cash had performances from Travis Kelsey, Hunter Renfro, and Patrick Mahomes, who still seems to be in some sort of funk down in Kansas City. With Generic Football Team winning this matchup 91.99 to 90.04. They moved to 3-6 and are now on a 2-week win streak, while Wu Tang Cash moves to 4-3 on a 3-week losing streak. This match was also the closest match this week with a differential of 1.95 points. Week 10 will see the GFT versus Team Marty, while Wu Tang Cash will take the field against Washington Fantasy. Our second matchup this week was Team Marty versus Any Given Sunday. Team Marty came into this one with a win last week and was hoping to repeat that performance and get the win here this week in week 9. However, they failed to mount enough points to take on an Any Given Sunday team that seems to be surging and has moved into second place in the South Division. Any Given Sunday got Dak Prescott back, which was a great help, but still only a mediocre performance at 22.88 points. He was bolstered by a 15-point performance from Cooper Kupp and a 14-point performance from Dalvin Cook. For Team Marty, Jalen Hurts put up 18.68 points, Devontae Booker with 13.7, and Matt Gay with 12 points. Hopefully, Team Marty can get some more wins in there as they take on Generic Football Team next week, while Any Given Sunday will take on Rebel Scum in a match that will likely decide the South Division for Week 10. Our third matchup was Stars and Stripes versus Washington Fantasy. Stars and Stripes came into this one strong on a 7-1 record and sitting first in the North Division, while Washington Fantasy came in at 4-4 and with a week 8 loss and sitting third in the North Division. Standout performance for Stars and Stripes were a great performance from Justin Herbert with 36.14 points, Joe Mixon with 25.5 points, and Mike Pittman with 14.9 points. Unfortunately, Matt Ryan and Nick Chubb had different ideas of what was going to happen in this game, as Matt Ryan puts up 33.02 points and Nick Chubb with 31.3 points. Another bright spot for Corey and Washington Fantasy was an excellent performance this week from the Cleveland Defense and Special Teams unit, as they put up 18 points in a score that likely eclipses the total of all the rest of their games thus far this season combined. With those performances, Washington Fantasy wins it 134.52 to 129.54. This was the highest scoring game of Week 9, and the highest scorer also beat the second highest scorer in something we're now going to refer to as turf burn syndrome. Week 10 will find Stars and Stripes versus taking the field against Team Scott, while Washington Fantasy will travel to the Wu-Tang Dome to take on the Cash. Our fourth matchup this week was Rebel Scum versus Team Deathrager. Rebel Scum, the obvious class of the league, was unable to mount a performance now for 3 weeks in a row and may likely be on their last leg. This is a 3-game losing streak now for Rebel Scum after Team Deathrager absolutely put it to them and wins this one 126.16 to 88.35 in what is the highest differential of the week. They just absolutely tore them up, bolstered largely by a 35-point performance from Jonathan Taylor and a 19-point performance from the New England Defensive and Special Teams unit. George Kittle for the Rebel Scum returned from IR and was able to put up 17.6 points in the tight end slot. And unfortunately, no other bright spots on that roster. Last minute quarterbacking change to Jordan Love that was was a calculated gamble, failed to pay off. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Week 10, we'll see Rebel Scum taking on Any Given Sunday, while the surging Team Deathridger will take on the Sandlot Turf Burns. Now we'll talk about our $5 contest. Our Week 9 contest was most interceptions for a starting quarterback. Four quarterbacks in Week 9 had 2 interceptions. Unfortunately, the tiebreaker was lowest scoring quarterback, and Joe Burrow of Team Scott posted the low score of 7.38 to hand this week's fiver to Helen. Congratulations to Helen of Team Scott. For Week 10, the contest will be longest field goal by a starting kicker. Get those legs warmed up and win that fin. You smell that? I think somebody made a crappy decision.
Who made a crappy decision? 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 Who? What? Crappy decision? Who? They thinking. Made a crappy decision? Who? What? Made a crappy decision? Who? They thinking. Made a crappy decision? Who? Made a crappy decision? Who? Made a crappy decision? Who?
Hello. Y'all remember me coming to you live from the sewer to tell you who made a crappy decision. Rebel Scum owner Eric had a last-minute replacement to make as Kyler Murray was a game day scratch. Not a lot of quality choices to be had, but when faced with a tough decision, Eric chose second-year Green Bay quarterback Jordan Love in a calculated gamble. It turned out to be a real stinker. Eric made a crappy decision. If Stars and Stripes owner Mike had started Pat Freiermuth, as was suggested last week by my esteemed colleague Frank the Fantasy Football Wiener, he would have won his match. Mike made a crappy decision. Rob of the Wu-Tang Cash watched as Nyheim Hines posted 19.8 points on his bench. Replacing either of his starting running backs with Hines would have netted him the win. Rob made a crappy decision. And now, Mike's crappy game of the week. It's Mike's crappy game of the week.
Game of the week.
It's Mike's crappy game of the week.
Game of the week.
It's Mike's crappy game of the week.
What is it?
It's really crappy. It's the game of the weekend. It's Mike's crappy game of the week. Week 9 was a tough week for a lot of teams, especially in quarterback scoring. Two of the worst this week faced off in the Team Scott versus Sandlot Turf Burns matchup. Team Scott quarterback Joe Burrow had a horrible game, getting only 7.38 points, worst of the week for starting quarterbacks. While Sandlot Turf Burns quarterback Derek Carr had the third lowest output with 12.34 points. Sandlot Turf Burns will be happy to see the return of Russell Wilson in Week 10 to bolster this week's return of number 1 overall pick Christian McCaffrey. In what was easily his lowest score all year, the Michael Jordan-managed Turf Burns were only able to put up 88.34 points, the second lowest this weekend. Luckily for him, he had some sort of reverse curse this week, and instead of playing one of the top-scoring teams, he played the team that put up not only the fewest points this weekend, but the fewest all season, with Helen's squad managing an embarrassingly low score of 57.98 points. How bad was it, you're probably asking yourself? Well, her highest scoring player had 18.4 points. Her next highest was 11.5. Team Scott had 6 players put up fewer than 8 points, with 3 of those putting up 8 tenths of a point combined. Team Turf Burns had fantasy MVP Cordarrelle Patterson have yet another great game with 21.1 points. No other player on his roster scored more than 12.6. An interesting final note, the 2 kickers in this game combined to put up a negative point. Again, that final score was Turf Burns 88.34, Team Scott 57.98. Sandlot Turf Burns, who have won 2 of their last 3, face Team Death Rager next week. The hottest team in the league, Team Scott, have dropped 2 in a row and will try to get back on the winning track against North Division leader Stars and Stripes. That was the news. With week 9 in the books, we are now past the midpoint of the 16-week fantasy football season. Remember to double check those lineups on game days and watch for those players on bye weeks. This week's teams on bye include the Colts, Dolphins, Patriots, and Eagles. The playoffs will begin in week 14, just 4 short weeks away. Let's take a look at the current playoff picture. If the playoffs started today, Stars and Stripes leading the North Division and Rebel Scum leading the South Division would each get first-round byes, with the 3rd seed going to Team Deathrager, 4th seed to Any Given Sunday, 5th seed to Washington Fantasy, and 6th seed to Wu-Tang Cash. Leaving in the consolation ladder, the Sandlot Turf Burns, Team Scott, Team Marty, and Generic Football Team. Remember that if records match, the tiebreaker for getting into the playoff bracket will be points for, so make sure you're optimizing those lineups. That's going to do it for this absolutely horrible week 9 of fantasy football. I hope that you will join us again in what will be a glorious rebound for Rebel Scum in week 10. Until then, remember, here at Fantasy Football News, we're deader than you.